She waits at the edge of the bed. Men wake with scratches and memories that don't feel like dreams. Mothers whisper her name when the crib is too quiet and the night feels crowded. They call her a baby killer, a sex demon, a witchcraft goddess, a feminist icon. So which one is she really? If you too are a sex demon, check out Pantheon, our brand inspired by myths, legends and folklore. We ship worldwide and are rated excellent on Trustpilot. Link in the description. The name never changes, the meaning never stays still. There is no single Lilith story. There never was. What exists instead is a trail of versions, each one shaped by fears, desires, and power structures of the people telling it. Every culture that touches her keeps the same name and rewrites the role. That is the real problem with Lilith. In the oldest layers of history, she is not a woman at all. She isn't a rebel, lover, or even Adam's equal. She is a presence in the dark, a night-hovering force tied to illness, erotic dreams, miscarriages, and sudden death. In the ancient world of Mesopotamia, spirits like her moved through heat and shadow as explanations for what could not otherwise be understood. She was named when something had already gone wrong. By the time her name crosses into Hebrew belief, she has narrowed, appearing only briefly in scripture as a night creature haunting wastelands and ruins. Even there, she remains indistinct, a silhouette at the edge of civilization. She still belongs to the margins, to uninhabited places, to what waits outside the campfire light. Then, much later, Lilith is given a story. It is here that Lilith becomes Adam's first wife, created from the same dust, placed in the same garden, given the same breath. And it is here that she refuses to submit. She leaves. She vanishes into exile rather than accept a position beneath him. From that moment, everything changes. Once she becomes the woman who would not obey, she can no longer remain a formless night spirit. She must be punished. She must be explained. Her early associations with death and sickness are weaponized. Now those horrors are consequences, retribution, the price of refusal. As Jewish mysticism deepens in the medieval period, Lilith grows again. She becomes a queen of demons, a consort of destructive powers, a mirror of the holy feminine turned dark. She is now worked into the architecture of the universe as the necessary shadow beneath holiness. In Christianity, her name often fades, but not her shape. She lingers in the night hag, the succubi, in the women accused of flying through the dark to meet secret lovers. She becomes the unspoken template behind countless female monsters whose crimes always seem to center around sex, children, and refusal to conform. In the modern world, she transforms again. Now Lilith is summoned by the occult as a patron of autonomy and transgression. She appears in poetry and art as the woman who said no first. She becomes a feminist emblem, a tattoo, a stage name, a goddess in modern witchcraft, a digital icon passed through aesthetics and aesthetics stripped of context. The same name moves through demonology, mysticism, psychology, rebellion, merchandise, and myth without ever settling. That is the real tension of Lilith. She is used as an explanation for death, as a warning against desire, as a punishment for disobedience, as a banner of liberation, as an object of fear, as a symbol of power. The name stays the same, but everyone uses her for something different. She never rests. Before there was a garden, there was the night. Before commandments, there were forces that moved through heat and shadow without permission. The oldest Mesopotamian texts describe them as pressures, as invasions, events that happened to the body when the body became vulnerable. Among these were the spirits that would one day be folded into Lilith. They were called Lilitu, Lilu, and Adat Lili, a category, a presence that moved with the wind, with storms, with sickness, with sexual panic, with the terror of the unseen. They were blamed when children died without warning, when pregnancies failed without explanation, when men woke from dreams filled with heat and shame and confusion. They lived at the edge of sleep and illness, where the boundary between the body and the world becomes thin. These spirits brought invasion. They were accused of arriving uninvited, of sitting on the chest, of stealing breath, of draining strength through desire and fever, of leaving the body shaken and hollowed without any visible wound. They belonged to the desert, to abandoned roads, to empty houses, to places where civilization thinned out and the rules stopped applying. Safety lived in walls, in firelight. Everything outside of that was suspect. Everything outside of that was hungry. This is why these spirits lingered near childbirth, why they hovered around beds, why amulets were hung over cradles, why incantations were pressed into clay bowls and buried beneath thresholds. These were survival technologies, attempts to bargain with something that did not speak in words. At this stage, Lilith does not yet exist as a woman, only the night as a place where the body can be taken without consent. But cultures change, stories overlap, gods inherit older shapes, and eventually the presence begins to condense. What was many becomes one. What was a category becomes a name. Fear becomes personal. The night spirit is no longer just what happens to you. She becomes someone who chooses to do it, and the moment a presence becomes a woman, the rules change. Once she becomes singular, she can be judged. Once she is named, she can be blamed. Once she is given a face, she can be punished. This is where the raw, formless terror of the ancient world begins its transformation into a moral story, and moral stories always demand a reason. A medieval text known as the Alphabet of Ben Sirah. This text expands on the details that Genesis leaves silent, and in doing so introduces one of the most disruptive variations ever added to the creation narrative. In this account, Lilith is introduced at the very beginning of human existence. Before Eve, before the serpent, before the fall, she is created alongside Adam, at the same time from the same earth by the same creator. There is no rib, no hierarchy built into the act of creation, no suggestion that one body is meant to rule over the other. Both are formed from soil, both receive breath, both awaken in the same world at the same moment. This places them, at least at the start of the story, on equal footing in every meaningful sense. The conflict between them arises from authority. According to the text, the dispute between Adam and Lilith occurs in bed. Adam demands the dominant position. Lilith refuses to accept it. Her argument is straightforward. They are made from the same earth. There is no inherent justification for why his body should command placement over hers. Adam insists. Lilith refuses. The conflict escalates. When no compromise is reached, Lilith speaks the ineffable name of God and leaves Eden. Her departure is an act of choice. She abandons paradise rather than accept subjugation within it. This is a crucial shift in the logic of the myth. In Genesis, humanity falls through temptation. In Ben Sirah, exile begins through refusal. After Lilith leaves Eden, the narrative moves her to the Red Sea, a symbolic boundary between order and danger. 3 angels are sent to retrieve her, commonly named Senoi, Sansenoi, and Semangeloth. Their purpose is simply to bring her back. They threaten punishment, they offer terms of her return, they promise restoration if she submits. Lilith refuses again. At this point, the myth introduces consequences severe enough to mark her refusal as catastrophic. In one version, she is told that 100 of her children will die every day. In another, she is transformed into a killer of children herself. But this raises an obvious question. What children? Lilith is punished through the destruction of her own lineage, a lineage imagined as demonic. In Jewish demonology, Lilith is believed to give birth to countless spirits known as Lilin, night demons like herself, tied to sickness, erotic dreams, and wandering predation. They are extensions of her nature. The declaration that 100 of them will die each day is a symbolic sentence of permanent depletion. She can reproduce endlessly, but she can never build power through descendants. Everything she creates is marked for destruction. Her punishment is endless loss. This is where the logic of myth turns outward toward humanity. Once her own children are condemned to constant death, the narrative flips. Human infant death is no longer random. It becomes retaliation. It becomes hunger. It becomes motive. The same figure who loses her offspring without end is now imagined as the force that steals the children of others in return. This is how miscarriage, stillbirth, and sudden infant death are absorbed into myth. Consequence? The loss is given a reason, the grief is given a target. This is also why protection rituals explode into prominence at this point. The names of Senoi, Sansenoi, and Semangaloth are written on doorways, amulets placed over cradles, incantations are spoken over pregnant women. These acts are defensive measures in a world where infant death has been rewritten as attack. The transformation is complete. Lilith is now tied directly to the collapse of reproduction itself. Her refusal is reframed as a threat to continuity and what justifies everything that follows. If she refuses the role of mother in Eden, she is made responsible for the loss of children outside it. That is the logic that is locked into place. What begins as sexual and social refusal is converted into a reproductive crime. The moment that Lilith steps away from the position assigned to her, the myth turns her into the explanation for everything that goes wrong where life is meant to begin. Miscarriage, stillbirth, and sudden infant death were already some of the most devastating realities of the ancient world. Communities lived with these losses constantly. The Ben Sira reframes the terror. It gives motive, it gives direction. Loss becomes a reaction to disobedience. Suffering is transformed from tragedy into consequence. This is the philosophical core of the Lilith figure taking form. The punishment attached to her is deterrence. The cost of her refusal is designed to radiate outward into the most unbearable form of harm imaginable. The message is, this is what refusal destroys. And that is what fixes the pattern that will follow her through every later transformation. Refusal becomes danger, independence becomes threat, non-compliance becomes catastrophe. From this point onward, Lilith becomes a narrative mechanism, a constructed consequence, a figure built into the story to make the rejection of hierarchy feel existentially unsafe, a warning about what it costs. The fear becomes domestic. It moves out of abstraction and into the rooms where people sleep, where loss feels most personal. At this point, she is believed to strangle children in their sleep, quietly and without warning. It is the stillness of a crib that lasts too long. It is the realization that something irreversible has already happened before anyone understands what is wrong. Nothing about her feels symbolic to the people living with it. It is immediate and physical and absolute. Pregnancy becomes exposed in a different way. To intrusion, loss is experienced as something that arrives from outside, as though vulnerability has become visible. At the same time, Lilith becomes a presence in the sleep of men. She is believed to enter dreams, to take seed, to drain strength through desire. Men awake exhausted, ashamed, and unsettled by what their bodies have done while their minds were absent. The experience collapses pleasure and violation into the same space. Sleep becomes a condition in which control can be taken. The same figure now holds influence over both ends of reproduction, over the beginning of life through pregnancy and birth, and over the surrender of the body through sleep and desire. For women, the danger is carried into the womb and into the crib. For men, it is carried in exhaustion, in confusion, and in the fear that the body has been used without consent. Both fears are drawn inward into the most private spaces of human life. The bedroom, the bed, the place where it is meant to be safe. Children are named quickly because unnamed things feel more exposed. Sleep becomes lighter. Parents listen more closely to breathing. The night itself loses its neutrality. Everything a household cannot safely name is placed onto her. She becomes the means through which fear is given shape when fear itself is too heavy to carry without a target. Once that fear has a form, even an imagined one, it begins to feel as though something can finally be guarded against. Creation is mapped as a vertical system of descending forces through which all life moves. Thought, authority, fertility, judgment, speech, impulse, and consequence pass through this and settle into law, instinct, bloodline, obedience, and rupture. The flow compresses in places, force thickens in certain channels, pressure builds most heavily where power regulates bodies instead of protecting them. Lilith settles where that compression gathers. She becomes bound to Samael, a consuming authority associated with accusation, the breaking of bonds, and extraction without return. Their union forms a shadow pairing beneath the visible order. Where recognized unions build households and inheritance, their pairing feeds on what collapses beneath law. Where one sustains lineage through name and record, the other harvests what falls outside naming. Their union draws from secrecy, abandonment, coerced intimacy, and the quiet aftermath that follows each of those wounds. From this position, Lilith becomes linked to the current that governs severity as it moves through the world. This current governs judgment issued by courts, punishment carried out in bodies, control written into marriages and reproduction, coercion enforced through inheritance and bloodline restriction. Sexuality moves through it when intimacy is pressed into obligation. Authority moves through it when command replaces relation. Obedience moves through it when survival depends on silence. Where the energy tightens instead of circulating through care, the same current gathers beneath the surface of daily life. The conflict that once unfolded between two bodies within a single space now unfolds inside structures that organize entire populations. A refusal that once occurred in a bed now repeats inside contracts, property lines, religious law, gendered expectation, and the unspoken rules that govern who may desire, who may inherit, who may speak, who may leave. Where the role hardens into destiny, pressure gathers beneath it. Where the order presents itself as unquestionable, the weight beneath the order accumulates inside human lives. The separation between Eve and Lilith becomes a fracture written into continuity itself. Eve carries authorized lineage through households, names, and inheritance tables. Lilith carries discarded lineage through children without record, lovers without bond, bloodlines severed by secrecy and removal. Eve's children enter the world through blessing and documentation. Lilith's offspring circulate through rupture, silence, and erasure. One line builds history, the other builds accumulation beneath it. The woman, who once refused a single imposed position, now occupies the position where all refused lives accumulate. The same force that once disrupted a household now modulates how hierarchy destabilizes beneath its own weight. What cannot move through sanctioned channels begins to move through hidden ones. Here, Lilith becomes tied directly to the question of what any system does to the parts of life it cannot integrate. She carries the cost of that exclusion. She preserves the heat generated by regulation. She marks the long consequence of demanding purity from structures built on breathing bodies that continue to move, desire, and fracture under restraint. People begin approaching Lilith deliberately. They approach her as a way of testing how much their life still runs on obedience rather than choice. The interest comes from individuals who already experience pressure around identity, sexuality, authority, and belonging long before any ritual language enters the picture. They tend to collide with roles rather than settle into them. They seek leverage rather than release. Her name appears in grimoires and working notes as something to engage rather than avoid. The appeal lies in what she represents inside a person's internal economy. She reflects a figure who chose separation over accommodation and carried the results of that choice directly. For people whose lives already sit in tension with approval, inheritance, and expectation, that reflection carries practical weight. It offers a model of agency that operates without permission and without apology. The relationship formed through her archetype attracts people prepared to recognize authority inside their own life. power shifts away from inherited expectation and relocates inside the chosen alignment. This shift produces direct consequences. Relationships strain, career paths feel misaligned, sexual boundaries move, self-image sheds former defenses, approval loses its position as the main regulator of behavior. What people often label forbidden knowledge rarely arrives as hidden information about the world. It arrives as an altered relationship to authority. They begin detecting where their obedience operates automatically, where fear directs behavior before choice appears, where identity functions as camouflage against risk. Insight takes mechanical form. The figure who once absorbed punishment on behalf of society becomes a reference point for individuals who decide to absorb consequence deliberately. Instead of consequence arriving from above as threat, consequence becomes selected terrain. Engaging Lilith in this way functions as training in separation from approval. What develops in exchange is self-directed alignment that no longer requires permission to remain stable. Calling Lilith here carries a practical meaning. The person asks for clarity under pressure. They ask to see how power directs their choices. They ask to stand inside desire without outsourcing responsibility for it. They ask to carry consequence without disguising it as fate. What follows depends on what survives that exposure. By the time Lilith reaches the present day, she circulates through fashion, social media, festivals, tattoos, branding. Her image becomes portable, shareable, wearable. She moves faster than meaning. The shift changes how rebellion functions. Refusal becomes something that can be displayed rather than lived. Disobedience becomes something that can be signaled without requiring confrontation with authority. What once carried consequence becomes an image that can be selected, filtered, and removed without lasting cost. Lilith becomes useful as a marker, a way to communicate independence, sexual autonomy, or rejection of authority without requiring the unstable conditions that real resistance produces. The symbol does the speaking, so the person does not have to. Platforms rewards recognizable imagery. Symbols that compress meaning travel farther than ideas that require struggle. Lilith becomes easier to wear than to inhabit. The image signals refusal while safely nestled inside commerce, entertainment, and personal branding. The algorithm, it scales her. This creates a split between the two uses of the same figure. One path engages Lilith through lived experience. Choice that fractures approval, desire that rearranges attachment, authority that relocates internally. That path continues to generate instability, loss of social buffering, and restructuring of identity. The other path engages Lilith as image. The symbol travels while the life stays stable. Both uses look similar on the surface. They feel very different inside the body. This is where the modern tension sits. If the image of rebellion produces comfort, belonging, and engagement without cost, then the rebellion has already been processed. Lilith becomes harder to locate. She never disappears. She changes placement. First at the edge of the room, then at the edge of the law, then at the edge of meaning, now at the edge of image. Each shift redraws the story around her. Each redraw leaves the core intact. Lilith chooses separation over containment. Order answers by renaming her rather than understanding her. Refusal still carries a cost. Distance from approval still reshapes attachment. Choice still rearranges what survives around it. The figure remains. What changes is who is willing to stand where she stood. When the place prepared for you no longer fits, what shape do you step into instead?